Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild och loggan till podden är gjord av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om den obskyra italienska thrillergenren Giallo. Till skillnad från majoriteten av andra Udda Ting-avsnitt så är det här ett ämne som jag kan ganska lite om. Det lilla jag vet det är att det är en sorts mysterietriller, en whodunit-thriller som enligt Agatha Christie och Hitchcock-modell, fast nu med blodiga och erotiska inslag. Giallo betyder gul och är taget från den gula kioskdeckaren som var populär under 20-30-talet i Italien. Giallon exploderade internationellt med Dario Argentos debutfilm Bird with a Crystal Plumage. Men både Fulci och framförallt Mario Bava hade gjort Giallos tidigare, före Argento. Mario Bava med sin The Girl Who Knew Too Much som räknas som den kanske första riktiga Giallon. Men efter debuten 1969 då med Bird with a Crystal Plumage så exploderade genren och ett hav av Giallos välde fram varje år. År 1971 var kanske det mest produktiva året och ett halvt dussin av de här 1971-filmerna lever kvar som kultfilmer. För att reda ut det här så hörde jag av mig till filmvetaren Troy Howarth som älskar Giallos och han har skrivit en 3 volymer tjock bok på ämnet som heter So Deadly, So Perverse, 50 Years of Italian Giallos. I have a very limited knowledge of the Giallo, so please tell me about the history of this genre.
It all really started in 1963 with the release of Mario Bava's The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which AIP put out in America as Evil Eye. There had been thrillers made in Italy before then. There was even a movie called Giallo from the 1930s, but they were all kind of more conventional mystery films. They were kind of in the tradition of like an Agatha Christie type thing, or drawing room type murder mysteries, or even noir type films. But the Giallo basically indicates, in filmic terms anyway, it indicates a very specific type of film, which is rather lurid. A lot of them have kind of a horror movie kind of vibe to them, even if they're ultimately thrillers rather than horror films. But some of them are both horror films and thrillers, for that matter. But that was really the accepted starting point. The Girl Who Knew Too Much, which was not a successful film when it came out in 1963. There were quite a few Giallo films made throughout the 60s, but very, very few of them actually made any kind of commercial impact.
I'm a very big fan of John Saxon, and if I'm not mistaken, he made a number of films in Italy, and among these films, he was in quite a number of these Giallos.
Yeah, no, that's very true. That's very true, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing John Saxon and of meeting him, and he's a very good actor and a very, very nice man. He, like so many of the American and English actors who ended up going to Italy to make these films, looks at them a little bit ironically. He's kind of surprised by the popularity of the films, but he certainly is appreciative of the attention that they've received years later. He ended up doing several. He ended up doing one with Dario Argento called Tenebrae, which, funnily enough, he didn't remember Argento or Tenebrae hardly at all when I brought it up to him. He really had a hard time remembering what the movie was. And I'm sure you've seen the film. You know his role in it is rather small, so that probably explains why he didn't remember it so well. But he remembered Bava very, very well, and that experience of making that film, because that was actually the first of the films that he made in Italy. He ended up doing a bunch of films over there all the way through the 1980s.
Did he say anything to you about his time working with Mario Bava?
Yeah, he told me that he liked him. He didn't know anything about him. Most people didn't. So he wasn't going over to Italy thinking he was working with some great maestro. As a matter of fact, what had happened was he was sort of being groomed as a teen idol type of actor in the sort of James Dean and Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift mold at Universal in the late 50s. And by 1962, his contract was finished at Universal and he was dropped, and he was very much afraid that maybe he was kind of a has-been. He wouldn't even have been 30 at that point, so be a has-been at 27 or 28, whatever he was. When he received a call from Letizia Roman, the actress who plays the girl who knew too much, as a matter of fact, and she was a friend of his. Obviously, Saxon is Italian American, and he was involved in the whole sort of Italian American community in Hollywood, and he knew Letizia Roman, and Roman had called him, and he said that she had an accent, strong accent, and so when she called him and asked him on the phone, do you want to go to Italy and make an R film? And he thought that she said an art film, so he's picturing going over to Italy and making a Fellini movie or something like that. And then he said he got the script in the mail and he realized this is no art film. It was a horror film. So he wasn't entirely thrilled, but he realized, it was good money, it was an opportunity to go to Rome, so he went over. He had no idea who Bava was. Bava had no idea who he was. And it led to a little bit of a problem between them because Bava got wind of the fact that Letizia Roman had insisted on having John Saxon play her boyfriend in the movie, which gave him the idea that Saxon was her boyfriend and that he was basically, kind of sleeping around to get jobs. He had no idea that Saxon was already an accomplished actor. So Bava didn't like that sort of thing, and he was a bit snide and sarcastic towards Saxon at different points during the shoot. He didn't realize that Saxon was actually fluent in Italian, so at one point they were on the beach and doing a scene, and in between takes, Saxon, who was obviously very, very fit, physically fit man, he was very interested in martial arts at a time when martial arts were not, it wasn't a common thing. And he was doing some judo moves or something like that in between on the location, and Bava saw him and made some comment about, oh, look at that jackass over there, and Saxon overheard him, and he understood what he was saying because he could speak Italian, and he thought, well, what's his problem, But they eventually straightened everything out, and they ended up getting along well together, and he told me that obviously he wasn't familiar with Bava's work at that time, but years later, from going to different sort of retrospectives and things like that, he saw scenes and clips and things from Bava's films and realized just how very good he was.
And then Bava made his next Giallo, Blood and Black Lace, which became sort of a template for the Giallo.
His next feature Giallo, although I would say in between he did a horror anthology hosted by Boris Karloff called The Three Faces of Fear, which was called Black Sabbath in America, and that film had a segment called The Telephone, which is a Giallo in miniature, basically, and it's even more of a template for what would happen later on than The Girl Who Knew Too Much, because it's in color and it's very lurid. It deals with prostitution and lesbianism and things that weren't kind of typical in movies of that period. But yes, the Blood and Black Lace was definitely the next feature Giallo that he made, and effectively that was the movie that really set the template for all the body count Giallo films that came later, especially like the Dario Argento films. That's the movie where you get the killer in the black hat, the black raincoat, black gloves, running around killing beautiful women in various different elaborate and very fetishistic sort of ways. When people talk about Giallo films, the go-to are even not just Giallo films, but the Italian horror film in general. The big three directors that everybody talks about are Bava, Argento, and Fulci, and there's good reason for that. They were the best, but there were a lot of very interesting films that were made by other directors, lesser-known directors, and some of the directors that come to mind for me were Massimo Dallamano, who made films like What Have You Done to Solange, and What Have They Done to Your Daughters, which I think are both excellent films. He made a Giallo earlier than that with John Mills, of all people, called A Black Veil for Lisa, which is, I think, also an interesting and rather underrated film. Sergio Martino, he also made those wonderful films with Edwige Fenech, movies like The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward and Your Vice is a Locked Room and Only I Have the Key. He made some of the films with the best titles. You just, you see a title like that on the marquee, you're going to watch it because it's just such an eye-catching thing. But also there was Paolo Cavara, who only made two, but they were both very good. There was a movie called Black Belly of the Tarantula, which is very much a kind of Argento copy in a way, but it's a very good copy. He also did a really, really weird offbeat one called Plot of Fear from 1976, which is not as well known, but is quite good. There were just a ton of them. There were so many interesting ones that come to mind that don't get talked about as much. I can mention off the top of my head Ernesto Gastaldi, who wrote a great many Giallo films and has also written Giallo books, Giallo novels. He directed a film in 1965 called Libido, which actually stars Giancarlo Giannini in his film debut. He was actually billed in that movie as John Charlie Johns because that was a time when they were kind of Americanizing names and they didn't want Giancarlo Giannini on the poster, so they gave him that silly name instead. That's a very interesting kind of gothic giallo. It's a chamber piece set in a kind of secluded castle with only 4 characters, and it's a very well done little movie. I wish it were more readily available. It's available. You can find it out there in kind of rough quality copies, but these movies really do deserve good transfers and things like that to be able to really appreciate their aesthetic qualities. There's also an interesting film from the same year by a director named Luigi Bazzoni called The Possessed. The original title was La Donna del Lago, which is basically the lady in the water. That's a kind of arty giallo type film, but it's coming out actually on Blu-ray from Arrow Films. They've been putting out a lot of the giallo films, so there will be a nice version of that to watch in short order. But that's a very offbeat and interesting one as well.
In what way was it a different giallo?
It feels more like an Antonioni film as opposed to like a Bava or Argento. It's one of those movies with people who are kind of bored and disaffected and sort of, there's all that sort of ennui and sitting around and brooding about their empty lives and glorious surroundings, that sort of thing where, they have all the money in the world and everything is nice and beautiful, but they're kind of bored and kind of restless. And it's not a film that plays by the same rule book, so to speak, as the typical pulpier movies that we think of, but it's interesting in its own way. Another movie that's like that too, that's better known and is available finally in a really nice version, is a movie called Death Laid an Egg, directed by Giulio Questi, which I couldn't begin to try to describe you the plot of that film. I'm not entirely sure I understand it, but it's a really wonderful kind of pop art giallo with Jean-Louis Trintignant and Gina Lollobrigida, and it involves mutant chickens and all kinds of just strange, inexplicable things. It's a very 60s movie, but movies like that, I suspect, probably wouldn't appeal as much to the people who just really enjoy the kind of killer in black going around and slashing up glamorous victims, but people who are a little bit more open to the more art house kind of side of the cinema probably would enjoy those movies a little bit more, I think.
For me, the most interesting things about these films are the magnificent poster artwork and when you read about the crazy plots.
Yeah, some of them they sound wonderful on paper. Then you watch them, and they don't work as well. Ricardo Freda, who was a very gifted director, unfortunately, after a certain point in his career, didn't really seem to care too much about what he was doing, and he made a movie called The Iguana with the Tongue of Fire. Again, what a delightfully weird title, but it's a terrible film. I kind of like it. It's one of those movies that I find fascinating, partly because it's as badly done as it is, especially when you consider a director like Freda had made it. But yeah, it's probably a more interesting movie on paper than it is actually sitting through it.
You wrote a book about the giallo titled So Deadly, So Perverse. What was your approach when you wrote the book?
It's basically like an encyclopedia approach. It starts off with, basically overview of what is a Giallo, the history of the Giallo. These movies didn't arise out of thin air. They were kind of an evolution in a chain. So you start off with kind of Agatha Christie type drawing room murder mystery things. Then you go into Fritz Lang and Hitchcock, and then you get into the film noir films, and there was the German creamy films, the Edgar Wallace crime thrillers, which are significant too because quite a few of the Italian films were co-produced by German producers. Very few Italian films during that period were purely Italian. Very often they would have German financing or French financing or Swedish or whatever. And the Germans were very prominently involved in a lot of these movies. So the Edgar Wallace films in particular are very important in terms of forming a link to what became the Giallo. And then the Giallo in turn kind of morphed and changed over time, and that was really sort of led into the slasher films. So it all kind of forms a chain. So the book kind of talks about what it is, how it got there, the major participants, and then year by year going through and reviewing each of the films. Inevitably, it is a subjective approach because it's like a lot of other things. It's the old saying about pornography. I know it when I see it. You can't really define it, but you know it when you see it. It's the same thing with Giallo films. Sometimes there are certain films that some people would consider to be a Giallo that I don't, and so I don't include certain titles. You mentioned A Short Night of the Glass Dolls, for example, which is a wonderful film, but I tend to think of it as more of a psychological horror movie as opposed to a Giallo. So I don't include that in my particular overview. Some people insist on calling Suspiria a Giallo. I definitely disagree with that. It's a supernatural horror movie, but I can understand why they do it because you do get some of those images of like the black gloves. There is the kind of riddle, the mystery that goes throughout, involving the irises, the secret room, and all that stuff. But it's not a Giallo from my point of view. But ask 10 different people and you're going to get different definitions.
So what's your definition? What's a Giallo to you?
I would define it, as I was saying earlier, as basically it is a specifically Italian film. I do not consider movies that are not primarily Italian to be proper Giallo films. That's an important distinction because Volume 3 of So Deadly, So Perverse, which is written and will hopefully be out in the first half of 2019, talks about movies that are non-Italian movies in the Giallo style. So that includes Spanish movies, German movies, American movies, British movies, movies from all over the globe, basically, that are like Giallo films, but aren't by virtue of the fact that they are not Italian movies. They must be Italian films, first and foremost. They're very, invariably, they have a kind of a pulp fiction flavor to them. So they're a bit lurid. They're a bit, they're either focused on perverse sex in some way or another, or they're focused on violence, so they essentially have a kind of a pulpy quality to them. They don't have to be violent, they don't have to be sleazy. Sometimes they're both, sometimes they're one or the other. Sometimes they are a little bit, as I said before, a little bit more offbeat and artsy. Sometimes they're very down market and very crass, but ultimately they all kind of hew to the same basic concept of offering a very lurid and rather kind of garish approach to a mystery scenario. Whether it's a series of killings or it's a more kind of a psychological head game type thing, that varies from film to film. Because there are a lot of Giallo films that were very indebted to Clouseau's movie Diabolique, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Movies like that basically deal with a psychologically fragile protagonist being manipulated by amoral characters so that they can drive him or her insane and collect their money or whatever. So there's a lot of movies like that too. But basically, just in a nutshell, they are Italian mystery thriller type films that have a very lurid kind of bent. That's how I would describe them.
Speaking of What Have You Done to Solange, can you talk a little bit about the director of that film, Massimo Dallamano?
Well, Dallamano was a very gifted filmmaker. Unfortunately, he died rather young. He was only, I forget if he was 59 or 60, but he was in a car crash, I believe, and so he died. He was a former cinematographer, and in fact, he shot Sergio Leone's first two groundbreaking westerns, Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. He made the transition to directing right around the time that Leone was making The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is why Leone broke off from him and started using Tonino Delacoli instead as a cinematographer. He started off, appropriately enough, directing a Western. He made a very good spaghetti Western with Enrico Maria Salerno called Bandidos. Very, very good film. And then from there, he made an adaptation of Venus and Furs, which was kind of a scandalous movie in its time. It's still cut in a lot of different versions. Starred Laura Antonelli, very erotic type film. And then from there, he started dabbling in Giallo films and the Poliziottesco films. But he made some horror films. He made some erotic films. He made a little bit of everything. He was a journeyman in the sense that, like Fulci and Bava were. But like Fulci and Bava, he brought a very distinctive sensibility to his films. Like Bava, he was a cinematographer, so his movies are always very stylishly shot, very well composed. And I think he was a very, very interesting director. I suspect it's partly because he died so young that he's not remembered a little bit better. I forget how many movies he ended up directing, surely no more than a dozen. But they're all worth seeing. They're not all great films, but they're all worth seeing. They all have good things in them.
What attracts you? What do you like in his films?
Well, stylistically, I really appreciate his movies. I like his use of cinematography and his use of editing and his use of music in his films. Just on that sort of formal level, to me, they're very slick and stylish and well composed, and I find them very engaging on that level. But I think also he was very good with story, and I think you can see that in a movie like What Have You Done to Solange, which touches on some extremely uncomfortable subject matter. And if it is possible to make a tasteful movie about a back alley abortion that goes wrong, and women being killed with knives being inserted up their sexual organs, he succeeded in doing just that.
I've heard that Nicholas Winding Refn, the Danish director, is doing a remake of Solange.
Yeah, that's the rumor. I don't know if he's directing it or if he's just producing it or whatever. I'm not really one of those people that gets upset by remakes. I wasn't upset by the remake of Suspiria, for example. So if it comes to be, it comes to be. If it's good, then we'll have two good movies. If not, then Massimo Dallamano's movie will always remain worth seeing.
I've never seen it, but I've heard there's supposed to be a Giallo directed by one of my favorite directors, Sergio Sollima, who also did the brilliant Italo thrillers Violent City and Revolver.
He did. As a matter of fact, he made one. It was the only one he got into, and it's one of those movies that I can't tell you the plot in any detail because it's been too long since I saw it, but I remember liking it a lot. It was a movie called The Devil in the Brain. It has a great Ennio Morricone score, as is often the case in these movies. The soundtrack is very memorable. And it starred Keira Dullea from 2001, A Space Odyssey. So that is a more, I can tell you it's a movie that it's a little bit slower and statelier. It's not a violent or gory type film, but it's one of those movies, it's more like a puzzle. And if you have the patience to sit through it and go down the roads it takes you down, it pays off. It actually builds, as I recall, to a very effective finale. Can't really say anything without spoiling it for people, but it's a very interesting movie.
Mario Bava, Lucio Fulci, and mostly Argento are the stars of the Italian horror and thriller. But we've talked at great length about them in previous episodes, so let's focus on the unsung heroes. One of the most interesting but seldom talked about Italian directors must be Aldo Lado.
Well, Lado actually has an interesting background in that for many years it wasn't talked about. It certainly was never talked about by Dario Argento, but in recent years Lotto has claimed that he had a big hand in writing Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Argento has never talked about that, and I can understand why. Bird with the Crystal Plumage actually, I don't know if you're aware of the fact that it was essentially based on a story called The Screaming Mimi by a pulp writer named Frederick Brown. And the book had been recommended to Argento by Bernardo Bertolucci, who worked with him on the script or the screen story for Once Upon a Time in the West. And the film doesn't credit Frederick Brown's book, and it doesn't credit Aldo Lotto, but Lotto in recent years has said that he helped Argento and had a big hand in the writing of that script. So if indeed that's true, then his association with the Giallo goes back to 1969 when that script was written. He had been an assistant director and then became a director with Short Night of the Glass Dolls, which is a very, very interesting film. Another movie that's very offbeat. Again, as I mentioned before, I don't tend to think of it as a Giallo per se. I think of it as more of a psychological horror movie. That could be splitting hairs, and it's one of those things that, you know, different people are going to see it different ways, but no matter how you classify it, I think it's a very good film, a very interesting film. But then he followed it up with another movie which is most definitely a Giallo by anybody's definition, and that's a movie called Who Saw Her Die, which starred the Australian actor George Lazenby, who had just played James Bond for one and only time in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And that's a very, very good film. I'm not sure if you've seen it or not, but I can highly recommend that one.
No, I haven't seen it.
You have George Lazenby playing an Italian sculptor, which is maybe a little strange on the face of it, but he's actually quite good in it. And his daughter, played by Nicoletta Elmi, the little redheaded girl from Deep Red and Baron Blood and Paul Morrissey's Flesh for Frankenstein, amongst other films, is murdered. And so he goes on a quest to find a killer, and yeah, it's a very, very good film.
Argento, as we said, is kind of over-talked about, but apart from the obvious debut with Bird with the Crystal Plumage, his other most interesting animal giallo is Four Flies on Grey Velvet.
Well, actually, his second film was The Cat o' Nine Tails with Carl Malden. That was another giallo, and it's a movie that Argento was dissatisfied with for many years. He talked about it as if it was his worst film. He seems to have changed his attitude about that, and I'm not surprised given some of the movies he's made in recent years. It looks pretty good. But Four Flies on Grey Velvet, as you mentioned, didn't get talked about for a long time, I think for the simple reason it wasn't available. And the weird thing in that was the fact that you know, The Bird with Crystal Plumage came out, and it was not an overnight success. It was kind of the similar story to what happened with John Carpenter's Halloween. It came out, it didn't do all that great, the critics didn't like it very much, and nobody really went to see it. But then through word of mouth, gradually it started to take on a life of its own, and it ended up becoming a huge hit. Neither one of those films, Halloween, which is kind of an American giallo in its own way, Halloween was not enormously successful straight off the bat, and Bird with Crystal Plumage wasn't either. But the success of that film put Argento into a good space where he could continue making the types of films that he wanted to make with a good deal of money. By the time he did Four Flies on Grey Velvet, a major American studio was involved, namely Paramount. And although Paramount distributed the movie in the U.S. and in some other sections of Europe, after a while, it just kind of disappeared. It was a casualty to the big studio in the sense that it was just a catalog title that they kind of forgot about and let sit on the shelves for many years and gathered dust. And the only way you could see it was in really, really bad 16 millimeter copies that were just awful looking. Any Argento movie is going to suffer enormously if you see it in poor quality, because his visuals, even if you don't like his stories, his visuals are always so interesting. And if you remove the interesting visuals, then you know the movie's going to suffer. So now it is fortunately available. It's on Blu-ray now, and it's easier to see it. It's an interesting film. It's also kind of an unexpectedly personal movie for him in a sense, because at the time that he wrote it and made it, he was going through a decline in his relationship with his wife. And he either consciously or subconsciously elected to cast an actress to play the lead who looked like his wife, and an actor to play the protagonist who looked like him. And so if you've seen the film and understand the sort of dynamic that goes on between these two main characters and their marriage and everything, you can understand that he was kind of working out some of his personal problems on film in an interesting way. Apparently when the movie came out and he took his wife to the premiere, she was livid afterwards and said, I can't believe you would make something like this. You made me look like a monster, kind of a thing. And it's something that nobody would have understood except people who were close to him, but obviously she picked up on it. So it's an interesting little movie. It's not one of his best films, but it's a very good film.
I forgot this story, but Michael Brandon was apparently cast in the role by Argento because of his eye color, and there was a short drama when Argento thought his eye color was wrong, and the mistake was eventually sorted out, and Argento was happy again. But it really upset Michael Brandon because he said in an interview that, what the hell, is this director hiring me for my eye color and not my talents as an actor?
I don't know anything about the eye color. I do know that there was he wanted to have James Taylor. Because, of course, the character is supposed to be a rock musician. So he wanted to have James Taylor, who I think had already done Two Lane Blacktop, if I remember correctly. And James Taylor wasn't interested, and there was a French producer involved, so they tried to get Jean-Louis Trintignant, who's a wonderful actor, but I couldn't picture Jean-Louis Trintignant playing a rock musician. So I don't know how that would have worked. And Argento apparently nearly got Michael York, the English actor Michael York. Terence Stamp was discussed. But Michael Brandon, to the best of my knowledge, and what Argento talked about later on, was he cast him largely because he looked a lot like him. They had similar builds. They both had long, dark hair. And so it sort of played into that thing about wanting to have a sort of surrogate on film. I don't know anything about the eye color unless he wanted somebody who had the same color eyes that he did, which is possible, but I don't remember reading that myself.
Richard Stanley told me a story when Argento screened his films in America for a bunch of producers, and Argento got up on stage afterwards and somehow he got into his usual rant about how much he hated Tony Massante, the star of Bird with Crystal Plumage. And he said, Tony Massante is shit, but I love Michael Brandon. Michael Brandon is great. He gave me my first joint.
It's a funny thing about that, though, is Tony Massante is wonderful in the Bird with the Crystal Plumage, whereas Michael Brandon isn't all that good in Four Flies on Grey Velvet, at least in my opinion. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Well, all the early Dario leading men are basically versions of Dario himself. They're all artist types, musicians and artists, and Tony Massante is a classic handsome macho man's man, and he really doesn't fit the mold in that Dario mold, so that might have something to do with it.
The problem with Massante was apparently he was coming from a background with the Actors Studio, apparently, and so he also had a little bit of an ego. So that the story that Dario always told was that after a day's shooting, he went home, and at like 2 o'clock in the morning, Tony Massante showed up on his doorstep and wanted to talk about the script, and he was just absolutely offended by that and thought this is ridiculous. He hated him. He said it repeatedly. Of all the actors he worked with, he hated Tony Massante and Anthony Franciosa from Tenebrae, who was also wonderful. Could be a difficult man to work with, apparently, but I thought he gave a brilliant performance in Tenebrae. And he also hated Christina Marsalek from Opera. Those actors he absolutely loathed with an almost incandescent passion. He hated all three of them.
But why did he hate Christina Marsalek?
By account of everybody who worked on the film, including Ronnie Taylor, the cinematographer, she was a diva. She didn't have a lot of experience, but she was playing the lead in this movie, and she had an attitude about it, apparently. And Argento typically gets along really well with his actresses. He likes women very much. It kind of goes back to his childhood, being around his mother's studio. His mother was a very famous photographer. She took portraits of all the big movie stars of the period, and he met, Sophia Loren and all these people. So he's always loved actresses and gets along with them very well, but he hated Christina Marcellak. As a matter of fact, the story goes that at one point in the film, if you remember, there's a fire in the film at one point, and she's sort of tied to a chair, blindfolded and tied to a chair, and left to burn to death. And the story goes that he allowed her to get just a little too close to the fire. It let her sort of singe herself at one point because he hated her so much. It's not very nice if it's true, but it's been said that happened.
1971 was really the year that Giallo exploded.
Well, I think with regards to Bird with the Crystal Plumage, one of the big things that happened out of that was because it was so successful, you saw a major upswing in production of Giallo films in 1970 through, in particular, 71, 72, and 73. There were a ton of them made during that time, more so than any other period of time. And almost all of the titles during that time were very elaborate, very Baroque titles, many of them with animals in the title. And that was the big thing, because Bird with the Crystal Plumage did well. So you had movies like Case of the Scorpion's Tail, Iguana with the Tongue of Fire, Lizard in a Woman's Skin, Don't Torture a Duckling, the Bloodstained Butterfly, you name it. There was always some sort of reference to an animal or a reptile or something. That's just the what they call the Filoni principle in Italian movies, where Filoni means stream. And so, the movie that comes out and makes a lot of money, there's going to be a whole stream of imitators until the well runs dry. So, if Dirty Harry comes out, then all of a sudden there's a bunch of cop movies that are similar. Death Wish comes out, there's a bunch of vigilante movies that are similar. And Bird with the Crystal Plumage was the movie that set off that sort of run of Argento-style copycat movies, basically, which he was very pissed off about. And he somewhat reluctantly continued making Giallo films with Cat o' Nine Tails and Four Flies in Grey Velvet, but after that, he basically said he wanted to get away from Giallo movies because he was sick of everybody ripping him off. The story goes that he was particularly incensed at Lucio Fulci because he felt that Fulci was really ripping him off, which he really wasn't. I would say Fulci was obliged to follow what was popular, as any working director was, but his movies are very different from Argento's movies. And if you compare those early 70s Giallo movies that Argento was doing with the ones that Fulci was doing, they're very different. And Fulci's movies are, I think, every bit as good in their own way.
Argento was kind of dismissive of Fulci at the beginning, and it was only later they became friends, after Fulci was old and sick and Argento felt kind of sorry for him.
Lizard in a Woman's Skin and Don't Torture a Duckling, again, it's just sort of similar titles, and these movies were coming out, and Lizard in a Woman's Skin and Don't Torture a Duckling were also fairly successful movies. They did well, and Argento was the king at the box office. I mean, he had nothing to worry about as far as anybody outdoing him on that level, but he just didn't like to see all these kind of similar titles and things coming along, and people making movies that were, along a similar line. Fulci really, in fairness to him, he got to the Giallo before Argento did, because he made a movie called Perversion Story, also known as One on Top of the Other, which was from 1969, before Bird with the Crystal Plumage came out. And he also co-wrote a very good Riccardo Freda Giallo starring Klaus Kinski called Double Face, also from 1969. So, all things being equal, Fulci got to it first.
One of the Giallos I heard a lot of good things about, I haven't seen, but I want to check out, is The Double from 1971.
Oh, that's a good film. That starred Jean Sorel, who starred in a lot of these films at that time. Again, there was a lot of French co-financing, so actors like Jean Sorel would turn up. And he was really good at playing the kind of superficial playboy, handsome guy that just seems to have everything going for him, who just is a little bit of a shit at heart, or is easily duped or whatever. Guerrieri, who is not a particularly well-remembered director, is actually significant because earlier in 1968 he made the first really successful Giallo movie. It was a movie called The Sweet Body of Deborah, which starred the American actress Carol Baker and John Sorel. And That movie came out in 1968 and was unexpectedly successful, and that resulted in a whole kind of mini glut of what I would call the sexy Giallo movies. These are the ones that are more like Diabolique. They're usually about some heiress or some wealthy woman who's being manipulated by nasty people who want to get a hold of her money and her property and everything else. So Carol Baker, as a matter of fact, did a whole series of movies like that, many of them directed by Umberto Lenzi, movies like Orgasmo and So Sweet, So Perverse and Knife of Ice. And all of those films are very much indebted to, especially to Diabolique. So Guerrieri may not be a particularly well-remembered director, and I don't think anybody would make a case for him as any kind of an auteur, but he does have the distinction of having made the first really commercially successful Giallo film.
And also, The Case of the Scorpion's Tail by Sergio Martino.
Case of Scorpion's Tail, yeah, that's a good little film. It was part of a group of movies that Sergio Martino made, really all basically between 1970 74. He made a series of very accomplished, very stylish thrillers. The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward was my favorite of the ones that he made, but he also did All the Colors of the Dark and Case of the Scorpion's Tail, and a movie that a lot of people really rate. I don't like it as much, but a lot of people rate it, a movie called Torso, which was, along with Bava's Bay of Blood, was one of the sort of templates for the later slasher movies, arguably. Case of Scorpion's Tail is one of those really, I think, cleverly plotted Ernesto Gastaldi scripts, which kind of successfully keeps you guessing. Gastaldi always felt that directors like Argento were lazy in their plotting and that they cheated a lot, and Gastaldi has always maintained that his thrillers differ because they make sense. I don't know that I always necessarily agree with him. I do think that some Argento plots work very well, and I also think that not all Gastaldi plots work very well. But a movie like Case of the Scorpion's Tail is based a lot on the whodunit aspect, and the joy of watching a movie like that the first time is trying to figure out who the killer is. And in that case, it is actually very surprising. Again, don't want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but it's not who you would think it would be, and that results in, I think, a very tense and well-executed finale. But it's another one of those movies that's sort of a globe-hopping Giallo type movie. Part of it's set, it's in Greece, and it's got all these wonderful, very elegant locations and beautiful women and very 70s costumes and scenery, and a beautiful score by Bruno Nicolai. I mean, it's just one of those movies that if you like these movies, it's like catnip, because it ticks all the boxes, basically. I mentioned Double Face before, which I highly recommend. Klaus Kinski gives a very, very good performance in that film. It's one of the relatively few Kinski films of that vintage in particular where he actually plays a leading role and he's in it the whole way through, even though Freda hated him and referred to him as the Crown Prince of Assholes, and ended up using a double to get around having him on the set all the time because he hated him so much. There are a couple other interesting ones, though. There's a movie called Top Sensation, also known as The Seducers, which stars Rosalba Neri and Edwige Fenech.
Speaking of Double Face, could you talk a little bit about that director, Ricardo Freda? He was an interesting character.
Freda, by way of a little bit of backstory, he ended up being very significant in the creation of the Italian horror film in general, although he himself was not a fan of horror films. He basically, he started off making films in the 1940s, and he made a film, I cannot remember the name of the title off the top of my head, but it was one of the big commercial hits of the late 1940s. I wish I could remember the title, but it was essentially a kind of an adventure film, a historical adventure type film, and it was enormously successful. He was apparently independently wealthy. He was also an inveterate gambler. He bred racehorses, and he was in pretty good shape financially. He made a lot of movies on bets. It was always well known that he would make bets with producers that I can make a movie in so many days. Sometimes he succeeded and sometimes he didn't. He really kind of wanted to be a sort of John Ford or Raoul Walsh type guy who was specializing mostly in action and in adventure type movies. But in the mid-50s, he and Mario Bava, who was his friend and his collaborator, Bava was working as his cinematographer and special effects artist during that time, they came up with the idea of making a horror movie. And that was inspired by the Italian release of Andre de Toth's movie House of Wax with Vincent Price. And so they created a movie called I Vampiri, or The Vampires. And that film was originally being directed by Freda, but Freda had a fight with the producers, as he often did. So he ended up leaving partway through, and Bava ended up finishing it for him. And then after that, Bava and Freda collaborated on a movie called Tiki, the Immortal Monster, which was a kind of a Italian variation on Quatermass Experiment, but also a little bit on sort of the Blob. And Freda signed it as director, although Bava pretty much directed it himself. And then in the 60s, Freda made a couple of very well-regarded Barbara Steele Gothic horror films. The horrible Dr. Hitchcock, which is about a seemingly respectable English surgeon who has a necrophilia fetish, and a follow-up movie called The Ghost, which is basically another sort of Diabolique type movie. Very, very well done movies, very elegant, very well crafted. But by the late 60s, his work was becoming a lot more erratic, and he was working a lot less. He only made 3 films that fit into the Giallo genre. The first one was Double Face, which I mentioned, with Klaus Kinski. Then he made a film in 1971 called The Iguana with the Tongue of Fire. Not a very good film, but I do have a certain affection for it. And then his last film as a director was a movie in 1980 called Murder Obsession, which is a very interesting kind of fusion of Gothic horror and high melodrama and Giallo and even slasher, splatter elements. It's a very unusual film. It's kind of a mess in some respects, but I'm very fond of it.
I know you did an audio commentary for a new Blu-ray release of Ricardo Freda's Tiki, the Immortal Monster.
Yes, I did, for the Arrow release, which was a wonderful chance for me to get to talk about Bava's work in that kind of context, because unfortunately I haven't had many chances to do Bava films, but I have done quite a few Fulci and Argento and Giallo and various other things, but Bava not so much. But I did get to do Tiki, and it's a fun little movie. It's kind of a mongrel in the sense that part of it's by Freda and part of it's by Bava, but it has some really surprisingly gruesome special effects for a movie from 1959.
I have heard that one of your favorite giallos is The Seducers by Ottavio Alessi from 1969.
Yeah, Top Sensation. Top Sensation is one of my favorite sleazy giallo movies. That stars Rizalba Neri and Edwige Fenech, both of whom are just looking their absolutely best in the film. And it's another one of those movies with characters spending a lot of time on yachts and plotting against each other, and everybody's screwing everybody, and everybody's trying to screw everybody over. And it ends up going very badly for pretty much everybody involved. It's one of those movies I love to watch, where it's just people basically behaving really badly to one another. And I guess that appeals to my misanthropic kind of bent. But it's a deliciously sleazy and over-the-top movie. Lots of sex and nudity and just really politically incorrect elements that are kind of outrageous today, but that's part of the appeal of it. That's a movie I highly recommend. Another kind of sleazy one that I'm very fond of, also starring Rizalba Neri, is a movie called Amok, directed by Silvio Amadio, co-starred Barbara Boucher and Farley Granger, who'd been in Hitchcock's Rope and Strangers on a Train. That's another one of those films where it's basically, characters plotting against each other in order to get hold of money. It's not really a body count movie in that sense, but another movie that's just chock full of all kinds of really sleazy and demented elements and very elegant. It's part of what I like about these films is that combination or the contrast between the really seedy, sleazy elements and the very elegant presentation, as far as the cinematography and the art direction and things like that are concerned.
Although we talked about it in the Fulci episode of Udda Ting, the lizard in a woman's skin must be mentioned in the Giallo genre because it has so many crazy artsy scenes. I mean, like the Francis Bacon-inspired makeup.
It's one of my favorites, and definitely I think one of Fulci's best films. Obviously it was made with a lot more in the way of production value than a lot of his later movies. He was given a very generous budget on that film. There's some, real kind of name actors involved in it, Stanley Baker, for example. And it's a very well plotted movie, and it's one of those movies that, pretty much does make sense. I mean, there's always going to be those things that don't, but for the most part, it does make sense. And it was kind of Fulci's commentary, in a way, on psychiatry, which he really distrusted. He disliked psychiatry. He disliked psychiatrists. And so a big part of the plot of that film has to do with this woman going to see a therapist and having her dreams analyzed and, also talking about suppressed desires and this, that, and everything else. But it turns out she's pretty much making it all up to sort of cover up something terrible that she's hatching. So in his own way, he's kind of attacking that notion in the film. But he's also playing with Hitchcock in that movie as well, in that you mentioned the weird Francis Bacon dream sequence. That's very much like the Salvador Dali dream sequence from Spellbound, which is another movie that deals with kind of dodgy psychiatry. So it's him taking elements from other films and playing around with them, but putting a very unique and interesting spin on it, which he typically did. It's a movie that, again, it chalks in a good deal of sleaze and a good deal of violence, but it also tells, I think, a very interesting story, and it builds a great deal of suspense. As a matter of fact, there's a sequence in it where Florinda Balkan is being stalked and menaced by a character inside this old clinic that reminds me very much of a sequence later on in Dario Argento's Suspiria. So the people who talk a lot about, Fulci ripping off Argento, well, sometimes it went the other way too.
Could you see a sort of evolvement of the Giallo genre from its start in 1960s?
Well, unlike the Western or indeed the Poliziotesco, it never quite died. It's still there. It's still, Argento hasn't made anything lately, and if you've seen his last few films, maybe it's not entirely bad that he hasn't made anything, but he is he is still talking about the possibility of making another Giallo film. There are other Giallo films that are made periodically, so they never really quite died out altogether, but it did definitely take a nosedive in popularity. Apart from the early efforts by Bava, which again were not terribly commercially successful, they were wonderful films, but they weren't really popular. If something isn't popular at the box office, nobody's looking to rip it off and make other movies like it. So you didn't see a bunch of movies like The Girl Who Knew Too Much or Blood and Black Lace because nobody cared about those movies in the 60s. So it was in the late 60s you saw a lot of the Diabolique style sexy Giallo films, which I talked about before. That gave way to the body count type movies in the 70s, thanks to the success of Argento's movies. That kind of emphasis on death scenes, murder scenes, and whatnot kind of mutated a bit into the slasher, and you could see that in Italian films, even like Michele Soave's Stage Fright, which it's one of those movies, some people don't consider it to be a Giallo. I do, although I understand why some people don't, because it really isn't a mystery. We know who the killer is, but it's, again, that emphasis on kind of sordid double dealings between the characters and really elaborate death sequences. So I think it kind of fits as an honorary Giallo. But during that period of time, as it was kind of morphing into this kind of more slasher type thing, where you had movies also like The New York Ripper, which is a notoriously violent and vicious and very sleazy movie, you also had literal porno Giallo movies in the late 70s. You started to see movies that, it started with movies like Strip Nude for Your Killer, Andrea Bianchi movie with Edwige Fenech, which, the title tells you everything you need to know. Very sleazy, very poor taste, but, it's a movie that you couldn't call it a porno movie, but it's got a certain amount of sleaze. Within a year or two after that, you have movies like Play Motel and Giallo of Venezia, which include literal hardcore porn scenes in addition to the kill scenes. So you have penetration of different types going on in those movies. It was the usual kind of thing. It kind of gave way also even to parody. I started to see the occasional parody movies that started to show up even in the early 70s. Franco and Ciccio, very popular, insanely popular Sicilian duo of comics in the 60s and 70s. They made a Argento parody. I think it was called something like 2.5 Cat o' Nine Tails in Amsterdam or something stupid like that. But it just, it just sort of gradually, through audience apathy, it started to die down a little bit. Again, when the movies aren't pulling in significant numbers of the audience, they're not going to continue to make them. After a certain point, only Dario Argento was really having much success with them.
Could we talk about Luciano Ercoli? He was one of the so-called famous Giallo directors.
Yeah, Ercoli was another kind of interesting journeyman. Forbidden Photos of a Lady Above Suspicion, which is a good Giallo in the Diabolique mold, has one of Ennio Morricone's greatest soundtracks, I think. The score is better than the film, although I do like the film. But then he did a couple of more Argento-style movies in the early 70s, Death Walks on High Heels and Death Walks at Midnight, which are also very interesting. Again, the great advantage that a lot of these directors had during this time was, unless you were a Bava or Dallamano type who had a background in cinematography, you had to rely on good technicians, and they had the best technicians in the world at that time. And consequently, a lot, if not all, of these films look very, very good. And also the music. I talk about the music a lot because it's I can't think of a single Giallo film that I really like that has a bad score, but I can think of plenty Giallo films that I didn't like that I really like the music of. So the music is also very important.
One of the things I have to bring up is Brian De Palma. Brian De Palma's obvious Giallo obsession in some of his films.
De Palma has been asked about Dario Argento point blank, and he's been very constant in his answers down through the years. He said that back in the 70s, Martin Scorsese showed him some Bava and some Argento films, and he didn't like them very much. He said the only one that he could remember watching was Bird with the Crystal Plumage. That was the only title that he could remember out of all those films. I see no reason to doubt him. I think he's honest enough as far as it goes, so he probably didn't really consciously draw much on those films, and yet he was making films that in many respects played like American Giallo movies. As a matter of fact, Volume 3 of So Deadly, So Perverse includes commentary on De Palma and several of his films. You can go all the way back to the 70s with Sisters. There's kind of Giallo elements in that film, going forward into Dress to Kill, really, in particular.
It's still hard not to wonder about it, in particular in Body Double, where he uses that trademark Italian synth soundtrack. And I can't remember off the top of my head now who made it, that magnificent score for Body Double.
Yeah, well, that's Pino Donaggio. Of course, he started off working with Bernard Herrmann, who was Hitchcock's composer. Then Bernard Herrmann died right after doing the score for Taxi Driver. And he started using Pino Donaggio. He also used Ennio Morricone on a few films as well. Argento, of course, would eventually start using Donaggio himself. Donaggio provided the scores for Two Evil Eyes and Trauma and Do You Like Hitchcock and The Sect. So there's kind of a crossover there as well. Yeah, definitely. You listen to Dressed to Kill is an extraordinary score. It's one of my favorite scores for any film I listen to. That main theme on a loop. It's just so beautiful. But there is a similarity, in terms of those big set pieces, especially like the kill sequences and things like that. You think of the big controversial sequences in a movie like Body Double, for example, with the power drill, which in its way also harkens back to a Giallo film from the 70s called My Dear Killer, which had a similar scene with a victim being power drilled to death, so to speak. So I think sometimes it's just, it is possible for two people to have similar ideas without being conscious of the other, if you know what I mean.
One of the films that was called the saver and the reigniter of the Italian genre was Michele Soave's Stage Fright.
Oh, Stage Fright. Well, yes, I like Stage Fright very much, and that's kind of a wonderful movie in many respects. It was made on a very low budget, and but it was smart low-budget filmmaking. It's a good example of low-budget filmmaking, setting movie inside that claustrophobic location, just a limited number of characters. And it's very much, in a weird way, it almost plays like a musical in some respects. That use of Simon Boswell's music is very prominent in the film. It's very 80s, which I suppose is very dated for some people, although I happen to like it. But it's an emphasis on very precise choreographed imagery and music, and the way the two fit together very well that you can see in Soave's work in general. Soave, I think, arguably had a big influence even in terms of his work with Argento. In opera, he did the second unit material in that film, a lot of wonderful material, and it seems to me during that period of time that he and Argento were working together, that was when Argento was being his most visually extravagant, and I can't help but wonder if Soave was kind of helping to encourage him to be even more extravagant than he had been before. But Stage Fright, as I say, it's a movie, you could class it as a slasher movie, but I will say that I think it's a Giallo, and it's a very witty film. It's very clever. I'm not particularly crazy about the ending, but other than that, I like it very, very much.
Not just the Giallos, but the Italian exploitation films overall in this period was really eccentric and crazy.
Well, I think that's why so many of us, regardless of where we come from, especially, I know certainly true of a lot of people in America, but there's very strong cult followings in other countries as well. A big part of the reason that these movies were embraced was because they were so weird. They didn't mind going the extra mile. I can remember watching movies like Lucio Fulci's Zombie for the first time, for example, and the famous scene with the splinter in the eye. You just didn't see that in other movies. Typically when it came to that point where the splinter made contact with the eyeball, you'd cut away. Fulci didn't cut away. It's hard to describe what's so wonderful about that to people who don't get it and don't like it, but those of us who do like it, we understand only too well that there was just something about that kind of, let's be honest, it was sort of a I don't give a fuck attitude. I'm going to take this, if this is what the scene's going to be, I'm going to take it to its most extreme. And so you got that with Fulci and Argento and Bava and Soave and all these other directors. They were willing to kind of push the envelope. They didn't worry so much about good taste. A lot of these movies are very tasteless, but aesthetically they're very tasteful. So isn't that kind of a funny contrast? I think that's part of it too.
What I meant by this is, at the time it was kind of a Wild West business. It was anything goes. I've heard stories about directors that openly masturbated during the shooting of the love scenes in his films. Insane stories that would never be tolerated today.
You hear stories about some of the things that people used to get up to on sets and the way they would behave and everything else. Well, of course, there's been a lot of controversy over the last couple of years about Bertolucci with Last Tango in Paris. Yeah, I mean, nowadays a lot of that sort of thing would be absolutely unthinkable.
Do you have any Giallo anecdotes from the people you interviewed for your book?
Just as an example, 9 out of 10 people that I've approached and talked to who participated in the making of these films have been very nice people and very down to earth and ready and willing to talk about these movies. I've had only a couple of unpleasant experiences. I won't talk about those, but what I tend to find for the most part is many of the people that were involved in making these films really, to a person, they seem to be surprised by the lasting popularity, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that they weren't taken seriously when they were making these films. Argento was an exception. Argento was actually, he was almost like a rock star in terms of his popularity. During that peak period in the late 70s through the 80s, he was, and he still is. I mean, he's still a celebrity in Italy, but he had a level of success and popularity that was very, very unusual, and he was taken seriously as an auteur. He may not have always gotten good reviews, and people may have dismissed movies at the time that they've since embraced, but he was taken seriously, and he was seen as a real sort of driving force in the Italian film industry. Most of these people were working filmmakers, working actors, working actresses, and it was just a job. The best of them took it seriously and did the best that they could under very trying circumstances. Very, very few of them were really being very intellectual about what they were trying to do. I think Argento, to an extent, was kind of giving it a lot of thought, and he was coming from a background too, don't forget, as a film critic and a theorist, and so I think he would put some thought into certain things, even if he said that he didn't. But a lot of them were just kind of doing the best they could to deliver a quality product within very, very tight resources. So basically, just my overall thing that I took away from interviewing so many of these different people and studying their work and everything else was just a real appreciation for them and their tenacity in going the extra mile to put detail and put things into these films that most people never would have noticed or given any kind of serious consideration to, because at that time these movies were regarded as junk.
If you go back talking about the Giallos that I've not seen but heard great things about, Murder by Design, also called The Designated Victim, starring Thomas Milan and Pierre Clementi.
That's an interesting movie. That's another one of those ones I was talking before about, the more sort of offbeat and arty type films. That would fit into that. It's not a sleazy movie. It's not a movie with a lot of sort of murder sequences and things like that. It's a little bit more psychological in its approach. Fairly low key and I think extremely well done, very well directed. I don't really know much of Maurizio Lucidi's work in general, but I thought he did a very good job with that particular movie. And if I remember correctly, the soundtrack by Louis Bacalov includes a couple of songs that Tomas Milian actually sings. So there's an opportunity to hear him singing as well. He actually did have a little bit of a career as a singer as well. I don't know if a lot of people know that, but that's a little bit of trivia about that film. It's definitely worth seeking out.
Then there is The Eye in the Labyrinth by Mario Caiano.
I don't have the greatest memory of that one. I know I wasn't particularly won over by it when I saw it, but that's not to say that if I watch it again, it might not impress me more. That's the great thing about some of these movies, is that you maybe watch them once and you don't think much of it, but then you see it the second time and you're better prepared, and it might play better. I know it's got a bit of a cult following, so I've always been a little bit curious, and it is on my pile to ever-expanding pile to revisit. But I can tell you the first couple of times I saw it, I thought it was okay, but it wasn't one that made a huge impression on me.
Well, I've heard it's a film that's famous for its great character actors, among them apparently Alida Valli.
Yeah, well, Alida Valli and Adolfo Celli is in it as well, and yeah, I mean that's part of the fun with these movies. It's like any other type of movie. I mean, there seem to be these actors that crop up time and time again, and it's always so much fun to see them. Alida Valli was always wonderful to see, for example, sure.
Then I have to mention the Giallo with the most out there title, Footprints on the Moon, apparently starring Florinda Balkan and Klaus Kinski.
Oh yes, that's a weird one. That's a weird one. That is definitely a very offbeat, very psychological movie. Klaus Kinski's in it. You would think from the billing that he's in it a lot. He's not. He's probably only in it for a few minutes spread throughout the movie. It's a very, very deliberately kind of cool and distant and very studied kind of movie. It's not a particularly emotional piece. So it's coming from a slightly more esoteric and I don't know. It's an unusual movie. That was a movie that the first time I saw it, I did not like it at all. I thought it was pretentious and I thought it was boring. But then I saw it again and I thought I like this. You know, it's another one that when you go into it the first time, if you're expecting something that it isn't, it's going to be very disappointing. But when you go back knowing what it is, it plays a lot better. It was shot by Vittorio Storaro, who's, of course, a very famous cinematographer. Beautiful looking movie. Luigi Bazzoni directed that one. He also did The Possessed, which I mentioned before, and he did a really good movie, Giallo, with Franco Nero called The Fifth Chord, which I would also recommend. But Footprints or Footprints on the Moon, depending on which title you go with, one of the more unusual, in a way, kind of closer to a movie like Polanski's Repulsion, in a way, than a typical Giallo story.
Ja, det blev ett helt okej avsnitt. Att beta av en hel genre i ett avsnitt är ganska omöjligt, samtidigt som jag själv var relativt grön på ämnet. Men jag har lärt mig lite nytt och förhoppningsvis så har ni också fått lite insikt i denna sunkiga men bitvis fascinerande genre. Ja, det var allt för den här gången. Mitt namn är Henrik Möller, musiken är skapad av Testbild. Hej då!